So here in this lecture video, we're going to look at Aristotle's Politics, the book that follows the Nicomachean Ethics. The Politics is a special book because of its relationship to the Nicomachean Ethics. On the one hand, it seems like the Politics would follow the Nicomachean Ethics because in the Ethics you get an account of the good life, what the purpose of a human being is, right? It's to flourish. And so then you would need the framework then that would be established by the Politics. So you know what it is to achieve in the Nicomachean Ethics. So you know then what to do for political organization. On the other hand, though, the Politics could be read as preceding the Nicomachean Ethics for the fact that you cannot live a virtuous life without there being the requisite material circumstances and social relations. And that's why the Politics, in this way, then, what we learn from it gives us the foundation for then actually flourishing. So the Politics has this interesting a relationship then with the text of the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, the chief question then is the end of association. So what is the end of associations? The ways in which then human beings come together and unite, they form organizations. This is where politics really comes from, the fact that human beings get together and live in groups. So we know that the end of a human being is to flourish. Now then what happens if you take human beings and put them together? So every association then for Aristotle is organized for the sake of some good. Every city is an association. So, he says, all associations aim at something good, and that the one that is most sovereign and encompasses all the others aims at the most sovereign of all goods. And this is the one called the city, the political association. So some associations might be families, for example. Some might be other trades groups, maybe like a business or something like that. But all of these ultimately being collected together, being governed together, they form what is called the political association. And so the end of politics then is to serve all these different associations and make them sovereign, meaning make them self-sufficient, capable of realizing their goods on their own. Now, the reason why he's interested in this question is because he wants to know to what extent is the association of the family different by matter of degree or by matter of kind, so something entirely different from, let's say, a family. And along those same lines, we can ask, is the difference between a political ruler, the head of a family, or that over a slave or worker just a matter of degree with the form ultimately remaining the same? Is it the case that a large household is no different than a small city? And if there is a difference, why? Here we start to see Aristotle's political naturalism, this argument that certain forms of associations among human beings are natural in that they serve certain purposes, that of which it makes sense why human beings get together and form families and form political associations and so on. To make this argument, he first begins with the idea that all individuals exist with human natures. So the mind naturally rules over the body. The mind tells the hand, to move over left and right for me, right? Or all the other things I want it to do. If I want to run, I want to walk. Men and women also combine to reproduce, right? This is how the species survives. He says the master uses intellect to rule, whereas the slave uses a body to labor. So, of course, slave labor was a major component of ancient Greece. And he argues that some people are naturally fitted to be ruled over, while others are naturally fitted to be rulers. That it seems like individuals exist with specific natures, where some are good at some tasks and some are better than others, in the same way that for the body, it naturally listens to the mind. The mind is fit to naturally rule over the body. So this leads him to the second premise. So if it's the case that human beings exist with these kind of natures, then we can also see when human beings get together and form a household, a family union, that this is the kind of association that's organized in accord with nature for everyday life. So the household arises for the end of fulfilling one, the perpetuation of our existence. 3. The village then arises when several households combine together. So the village is the first kind of association that's composed of more than one household that does not serve purposes of a daily sort. The household serves purposes of a daily sort, but we don't necessarily, wash the dishes, or we don't necessarily care about who's going to wash the dishes, or take care of the clothes and so on, right? In the case of a village unit, right, that's done within the specific kinds of families, right? These daily tasks. The village is concerned with protection, perhaps, of each individual household, right, collectively together. But a political association is a bit different than a village. The reason is that the city is the complete association, or a political association is a complete association that's made of more than one village. And it's complete because, Aristotle says, it gets to the threshold of full self-sufficiency, coming into being for the sake of living, but being for the sake of living as well. Hence, every city is by nature, if in fact the first forms of association are as well. And that for the sake of which, the end, is also what is best. And self-sufficiency is both an end and what is best. From these things, then, it is plain that the city is one of the things that are by nature, and that a human being is by nature an animal meant for a city, or, in another translation famously, a human being is a political animal. So ultimately, the city is made to ensure the perpetuation and the sovereignty of the household, which ensures their perpetuation and sovereignty of the individual. And it only does this by achieving self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency in the fact that it is the human beings themselves that rule over themselves to ensure that the association remains in accord with itself. But also in the fact that it needs certain material resources such that then it is made sufficient and it's not reliant on other associations for its own existence. Now, Aristotle argues the end or the purpose of a city then is to live well. It is to ensure the ability to morally flourish. And that a city is not necessarily, its purpose is not necessarily concerned with property or other like things. So the virtue argument here from Aristotle goes against the liberal philosophical argument that the purpose of a city or a political association, or in other words, a government, is to ensure the protection of private property and other rights. Aristotle is saying, no, the function of a city, the reason why it exists, is to live well, to provide that kind of framework or the foundation for moral flourishing. So Aristotle says if people came together and entered into association for the sake of possessions, so if we wanted to say that the sake of a city, or the city exists for the sake of, let's say, private property, then those who enter into, right, become citizens, we'll say, of a specific government, they would have a share in the city exactly as much as they had a share in property. And the oligarchs then would consequently seem to be strong. So if it was the case that the end of a city is to be concerned with private property, then it would be the case that whoever holds more property has more say over the functions of the city than people who have less functions. And that, as we'll see, is not ideal. Furthermore, Aristotle says, a city is not an association in a place for the sake of not doing injustice among themselves and doing business. So the point of a city is not simply just to do business. These things, he says, necessarily have to be present if it is going to be a city, because it's how you become self-sufficient. But when they are all present, it is not on that account a city. If that were the case, then we can just look at a marketplace and say the marketplace or a specific business is itself a city. But instead, he says, a city is instead an association of households and families in living well for the sake of a complete and self-sufficient life. Business isn't necessarily concerned with living well, right? It is concerned with making money, trading, and things like that. And that might be important for living well, but the problem is that if a city were solely concerned with that, then it could end up sacrificing certain family necessities for the sake of making a profit. So here, Aristotle takes actually his argument that we find in the physics for the causes of all things and graphs it onto the cause of a city. So if we want to know what is the nature of the city, we get an argument right here. So the city-state is a hylomorphic or a matter-form compound. It has 4 different causes. The material cause is its particular population in a given territory. The formal cause is its constitution. The efficient cause is the ruler, lawgiver, or politicians, the ones who carry out then the constitution. And the final cause then, of course, is the good life for the sake of achieving eudaimonia. So the fundamental, then normative problem of politics for Aristotle, the question that is chief in studying political philosophy: what constitutional form should the lawgiver establish and preserve in what material for the sake of what end? So what kind of constitution, what should be the formal cause of a city in order to achieve the final cause, a good life? So let's look at this first question here. Who should rule in a city? So we're primarily going to be concerned with just asking these questions and becoming closer with considering, right, the idea of a ruler, the idea of the construction of a city, and so on. So we're not necessarily going to get thorough answers here in this video lecture. First, let's look here, page 81. So who should rule in a city? Aristotle says here, it is obvious then that a city is not an association in a place for the sake of not doing injustice among themselves and doing business. These things necessarily have to be present if it is going to be a city. But when they are all present, it is not on that account a city. A city is instead an association of households and families in living well for the sake of a complete and self-sufficient life. This will not be possible, however, unless they occupy one and the same place and practice intermarriage. This is why marriages came with the purview of cities, along with fraternal organizations, religious rites, and shared forms of recreation. And this sort of thing is the work of friendship, because friendship is a choice to live well, to live life in common. The end aimed at by a city is living well, and these things are for the sake of that end. And a city is an association of families and villages in a complete and self-sufficient life. And we claim that this is living happily and beautifully. It must be set down, therefore, that the political association is for the sake of beautiful actions and not for the sake of living together. If it's for the sake of living together, then we have to ask about the question of authority. So he says, what the authority in a city ought to be is a matter of difficulty. For it is either the multitude, or the rich, or the decent people, or the best person of all, or a tyrant. Because we have already said that the purpose of a city is not for the sake of only preserving private property, let's say. Because if that were the case, then whoever owns more private property basically has more votes, we could say, right? We want to know then what is the kind of form that should take place, the kind of constitution. And that determines then what the kind of ruler should be, because the ruler is going to have to carry out the constitution. Should it be the case that all have a say in the construction of a city? Should it be the case that maybe only an expert or a few experts have a say, or the wealthy? But all these, so rule by the multitude, so like a kind of direct democracy, the rich, rule by decent or moral people, or the best person, or a tyrant. All these options involve something hard to swallow, he says. For what if the poor, because they are the majority, divide up the things that belong to the rich? Is that not unjust? Well, he says, by Zeus, it was enacted justly by the authority, someone might say. Then what should one say the utmost injustice is? If, after everything has been taken, a majority once again divides up the things that belong to the minority, it is obvious that they will destroy the city. But it is certainly not virtue that destroys the thing that possesses it, and justice is not something that can destroy a city. So it is clear that this law cannot be just. It would also mean that whatever actions a tyrant undertook would necessarily all be just. He is stronger and uses force, just as the multitude does with the rich. But is it a just thing, then, for the minority and the rich to rule? If they do the same things, then, and seize and take possession of the property of the multitude, that is just. Therefore, the other is too. So it is obvious that all these things are bad and not just. So should the decent people rule and be in authority over everyone? Then it is necessary that the others will be all be deprived of honor, since they are not honored with political offices. For we speak of offices as honors, and when the same people are always ruling, the rest are necessarily deprived of honor. So is it better for one person of the highest excellence to rule? But that goes still further in the oligarchic direction, since more people are deprived of honor. But perhaps one might claim that it is a bad thing for the authority to be a human being at all and not the law, since he's bound to have the passions attendant upon the soul. But if law can be oligarchic or democratic, what difference will that make to the difficulties that have been raised? For the things already said will follow just the same. So we have certain options. Of course, if it's the case that the oligarchy will rule, well, then the rest of the city could be sacrificed for the sake of those few who own a lot of money to make more money. Should the majority rule? Well, if the majority rule, perhaps they end up overthrowing vital institutions that maybe some people don't think they have value, or the fact that the mob, we could say, could be persuaded by someone else. Well, we don't also want a single person, like a tyrant, to rule, because then law becomes arbitrary. It becomes whatever that tyrant decides is the most just. Would it be the case that only the most moral rule? Well, perhaps that seems to make sense, because then maybe they would be the wisest, the most caring. But then what does that mean about everything else? What does that mean about the idea of citizenship? If no one else, then, if they're not the most moral, has no say then in the rulings of government? Now, Aristotle is going to lean towards the idea of the most just people ruling. But we still have to ask other certain questions, like who judges then the aptitude of a ruler or those who are in charge? The politicians, maybe, we could say. Who determines whether they're fit? If we want to say, well, we want a democracy, well, how do we know that the people's choice is the best choice? So here Aristotle says, but this arrangement of the government does have a difficulty. Because, in the first place, judging who has been correctly cured would seem to belong to the same person whose job it was to cure the disease when it was present and make the sick person healthy, and that is the doctor. Right? So imagine, well, the people in the city say, we want to elect the best person to rule. Well, wouldn't only the best person know who the best person is to rule? Because everyone else would not be the best person. So how could we know they have the correct aptitude to rule? And it is similar with the other kinds of experience in art. So just as a doctor ought to hold himself accountable to doctors, the others too should be reviewed by their peers. But a doctor is either a practitioner or a master of the art, or thirdly, someone educated on the subject, for there are some people of this sort with just about all the arts, and we turn over the act of judging to those who are educated in the subject no less than to those who know it. So then it might seem to be the same way with electing as well, for making a right choice is a job for those with knowledge. It belongs, for example, to geometers to choose a geometer, and to helmsmen to choose a helmsman. So maybe, for example, with the art of carpentry, being familiar with a house, for instance, is not something that belongs only to the one who makes it. The one who uses it is even better at judging it. And it is the household manager who uses it. A helmsman is a better judge of a rudder than a carpenter is, and the guest, not the cook, is a better judge of a meal. So we might want to ask then, how could we say that people who aren't involved with ruling, who live their day-to-day lives as perhaps a carpenter, a teacher, a doctor, or whatever else, know who is best fit to rule? How can we be so sure about that? We have a lot of questions being raised here. So again, who elects the rulers? It would probably seem that that one could resolve this difficulty adequately in this way, but there is another difficulty connected with this one. For it seems absurd that people of inferior character should be in authority over greater matters than decent people. But the greatest matter is the reviewing and electing of those who rule. And as was said, this is turned over to the populace in some constitutions, since the assembly is an authority over all such things. Yet those who take part in the assembly and do the deliberating and judging come from the low property classes and are of any random age, while those who control the treasury and serve as generals and rule in the highest offices come from the highest classes. But one could resolve this difficulty too in a similar way. For perhaps these things too are done rightly, since it is not the person who judges or deliberates or serves in the assembly who is ruling, but the court or deliberative council or populace. And each of the persons mentioned, I mean the counselor, assemblyman, or judge, is part of these bodies. So the multitude is justly in authority over greater matters, since the populace and deliberative council and law court are made up of many people, and the property assessment of them all is greater than that of each one, or the few who hold the high ruling offices. These questions, I should say, are very relevant to today because, on the one hand, we think that perhaps those in charge can become corrupt and they don't do what's in the best interest of the people. So we want the people to decide who should be the rulers. On the other hand, sometimes the people don't know what's actually best for themselves. And we might say, well, then the people should rely on experts, right? It would be like saying, why should, if a electrician comes over to fix something in someone's house, the owner of the house tell the electrician what to do? That would seem kind of absurd. So why would it be the case that the general populace gets to decide who is going to be in charge of ruling and what the ruler should do? Shouldn't it be the person who has best studied what it is that enables a city to flourish? Well, then what do we say about then the rights of citizens or the ends of government to flourish? And in the involvement then that everyone should have equally, as they all have an equal stake in the city, since everyone is concerned with flourishing as a human being. So, further considerations. Is it more advantageous to be ruled by the best person or the best laws? So we might think that the best form of government is not underwritten laws, that a wise person has better judgment than a general law, right? We might think it's obvious that sometimes a law can't, sometimes a law, when implemented, isn't able to account for particular cases that maybe fall through the cracks or that weren't foreseen by the people who wrote the law, which is why you want a wise person who's able to apply the law and know, actually, the way this law is being applied here, it goes too far, right? We shouldn't take the law literally in this case. Perhaps it's punishing someone too much for something that the law didn't foresee. Now, if we want to say that's the case, that a wise person is better because they're able to attend to the particulars, whereas a law is obviously general in nature, Aristotle says this is difficult to find. So the law in this case then is more choice-worthy than having any one of the citizens rule arbitrarily. So in an ideal situation, you would want a wise person to rule. So in the best world, we would say, we would have a wise person rule. Aristotle, though, wants to be a bit more practical. So his argument is that the best possible case is for the law to rule, because the law then can be applied, hopefully, if it's established in the best way possible, right? The law can be general in nature and not prejudiced towards any particular individual like a single person could be. If then we want to say the law is more choice-worthy, then it makes sense to say that seeking justice is seeking the law. That the law then is the mean between the extreme of a single ruler, whether they be wise or tyrannical, and the law is also the mean between then the multitude, whether that be in the case of tyranny of the majority. So we have then a causal account of the forms of government according to Aristotle, the ways in which governments can go wrong, wherein they don't actually follow perhaps the best established law. So Aristotle says, if rule by more people than one, who are all good men, is to be set down as aristocracy, while that of one person is kingship, aristocracy would be more choice-worthy for cities than kingship, whether its rule is with or without force of arms, as long as it is possible to get a number of people alike in virtue. And perhaps it was for this reason that people were ruled by kings in earlier times, because it was a rare thing to find men who far surpassed the rest in virtue, both for other reasons and because the cities they lived in at that time were small. Also, they made people kings as a result of their public services, which is precisely the work of good men. But when there came to be many people alike in virtue, they no longer put up with a king, but sought something communal and set up a constitution. And when people became worse and enriched themselves from public funds, it was reasonable at that point, from that cause, for oligarchies to arise, since they took wealth to be a mark of honor. And from these they changed first into tyrannies, and from tyrannies into democracy, or by constantly drawing things into fewer hands on account of greed, they made the multitude stronger, so much so that they attacked them and democracies came into being. And now that cities have gotten to be larger, it would probably not be easy anymore for any other form of government to come into being except democracy. To keep a better kind of harmony then from these transitions of governments, you need then good law. Law is the thing which provides stability. Now I already mentioned Aristotle tries to be a bit more practical than necessarily ideal, but he doesn't dismiss the value of idealizing justice in the best possible constitution. So his approach to politics is both, in one sense, anti-utopian, and then yet also non-ideal, for two reasons. One, consider universal versus particular. So deliberative judgment in ruling, he says, is needed, since one, laws make universal determinations which are necessarily general, which is why we don't just have law, but we need rulers who interpret law. And two, then, particular situations arise which the law will be incapable of explicitly addressing, if at all. Then we can look at ideal versus concrete. So one example of this is where we would say democracy is generally not desirable because it pursues equality as the highest good, which can lead to ostracizing those with any manner of authority. If we seek equality as the highest good, then this might actually negate some cases of moral desert. However, for Aristotle, it can sometimes, though, be just to sometimes pursue democratic ostracization as a kind of correction, in the same way that he explained how it is that oligarchies likely led to the rise of democracies. So Aristotle doesn't make sweeping claims outright that one system is good and one system, another system is bad. There's a way in which it depends on the context and how you apply it, but in taking all those cases into account, you can see then what are the general trends that give the best chance of a city to flourish, to achieve its end, its purpose as being a political association at all. What he finds then is, again, looking for the mean between extremes, is that a government with few rulers is the best possible government. And specifically, it's a moral aristocracy that is the best. So forms of government that rule with a view to the common advantage are necessarily right, where those that rule with a look to private advantage are deviations from the right. So in the case of one ruler, kingship is better than tyranny, where tyranny has the advantage to the individual over the populace. And with a kingship, right, this person would be wise, where although they're one ruler, they are ruling for the sake of the entire city. Now, an aristocracy is better than a kingship for the fact that one person, even if they're wise, it can still lead to arbitrary decrees. Whereas if you have multiple people, they can keep each other in check. And in that case, if you have moral leaders, a group of moral leaders, then that is preferable to an oligarchy where you just have a group of rich people, where the only advantage that's sought by that form of government is to the advantage of the rich minority. I think one way to interpret here when he means aristocracy, we can also think of this as a kind of um, uh, elected representative government, perhaps a republic, um, but a republic where the most moral are still in charge. Now, a constitutional democracy is preferable to a just outright direct democracy, where again, the advantage in a direct democracy is to the poor majority, whereas a constitutional democracy keeps checks on sweeping claims where democracy can become tyrannical against the minority. And then, even though kingship is preferable to tyranny and constitution is preferable to democracy, it is the case that aristocracy rules the best. And for Aristotle, then, aristocracy is the best possible form of government.